Hello, good afternoon. Jason Birch for the second time on the Keen Yoga podcast. It's lovely to have you again, to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Well, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, and surprisingly, and probably of no interest to the current audience, we're both in Australia. Jason's in Tasmania. And for some reason, well, not for some reason, because it's enjoyable, I'm in Sydney right now. So we're on the same time zone, which is kind of strange as well. A nice civil time of day in the afternoon. Lucky coincidence. Lucky for the audience, because this book that we're talking about today is, I believe this is a new piece of work from you, Jason, or did you put this together over the years, or is it a most recent study? The Yoga Chintamani is the name of the book.
Yes, it's the most recent publication of mine, but I've been working on it for well over 10 years.
That's what I assumed. And just before we crack on, I mean, is there any way people will be able to get this publication? Because I know that these are not just, Yeah,
it is sort of, you might say, a small publishing house. It's a small academic publishing house in India, Pondicherry. So there's a link to the website, the École Française. It's a French Indian institution, and it basically you can purchase it by sending them an email, and then they will give instructions about how you can pay for it. It's only about €20, I think, so it's quite cheaply sold at a reasonable price.
Yeah.
For an academic book in particular,
absolutely.
It's very reasonable. And yes, and then they'll post it to wherever the person is, and they pay for postage.
Okay, right. I mean, and I wanted to put that across because I think this, this particular work that you're doing, and all of the work of the Hatha Yoga projects that you've been involved in with the other gang that we've had on, is really so important for the modern practitioner of asana, because it gives so much context and somewhat a precedent, to look back and see what was done previously. And increasingly what you're doing, you seem to be mining further and further back, as it were, coming from past, works on Hatha Paddhati, which is a great publication you made. And then originally all we had is obviously Norman Soyman's Yoga Traditions of the Mysore Palace, where he was talking about the Tattva Nidhi, and Jason on the last podcast, to rehash that a little bit, went back and talked about how from Norman you managed to start tracking back a precedent for the Tattva Nidhi and carried of course actually you knew that there was previous works before that, didn't you, after all?
Yes, that's the next book, Adam. Our book on the Hatha Paddhati, co-written with Mark Singleton and James Mallinson. So it's being sort of processed by the printers now and should be out in a month or two. But yes, that's really looking at the most recent history, the 18th, 19th century. And then the book that we discussed during the last podcast, which I published a couple of years ago, was on the Amaralga, and that really looks at the origins of some of the physical practices that have been taught for the last 1,000 years as Hatha Yoga. And the book on the Yoga Chintamani is really looking more at the intermediate period, the sort of 16th, 17th century, which is an interesting time in the history of yoga, because it's the Hatha Yoga in particular is sort of going from a fledgling practice that's developing in different ways from the 12th to the 15th century. And then by the time we get to the 16th and 17th century, it's sort of being codified by the Hatha Pradipika into a format that's widely adopted around the Indian subcontinent. And then what we see in the 16th and 17th century is more and more techniques being added to the basic format of Hatha Yoga that's outlined in the Hatha Pradipika. And that's what drew my interest to the Yoga Chintamani, the main focus of the book that I've written, because it's a good example of a scholarly compendium on yoga. So a lot of the earlier texts, including the Hatha Pradipika, are very basic. They're pithy and rudimentary. They just give you the bare bones, the bare outline of the practice. They say, yes, you do asana, pranayama, there are these kumbhakas, then there's the 10 mudras, and then usually at the end of the text, it'll talk a little bit about samadhi and liberation, Raja Yoga. But by the time the Yoga Chintamani is written, these yogas, Hatha and Raja Yoga, have become sort of more mainstream, more widespread, and so various authors are wanting to incorporate them into their texts. And as they do that, they start to bring in more theory and blend these yogas with other types of yoga, in particular Patanjali yoga, as well as the yoga in the Puranas, the Bhagavad Gita, all the other varieties that were out there at the time.
Yeah.
And of course, what happens when they do that, when they bring in more theory and they create this synthesis of different, blending these different types of yogas, is their texts get larger and larger, and more sort of elaborate and sophisticated. They broach more topics. At the beginning of the Yoga Chintamani, for instance, about the first four or five pages is just on the question of what is yoga. And that's a fascinating discussion because he draws definitions from all sorts of different traditions and texts and tries to weave them into a coherent narrative. And in the introduction, the focus of my work, my research on the Yoga Chintamani is mainly the Asana section, the postural practice, because it's really the most elaborate discussion of postural practice that we have really from the pre-modern corpus of yoga text. But the text as a whole really drew my interest because of its syncretic nature and the author's attempt to answer big questions like what is yoga from a scholarly perspective, drawing on all sorts of different traditions and bringing them together and trying to make sense of it. So he starts off with, yoga is samadhi, which of course we see in Patanjali Yoga. The second sutra, Chittavritti Nirodha, yoga is cessation of mental activity, which, as the commentary says, is basically samadhi, this profound state of meditation in which there's no mental activity, no physical movement, no object of meditation. It's sort of beyond all other yoga practices. And it's really the essential thing that a yogi has to practice in order to achieve liberation from worldly life, from samsara, the world of suffering and rebirth and so forth. So samadhi is the culmination of practice. You might be doing postures, breathing exercises and meditation techniques, but unless you achieve samadhi, you're not really going to escape the problems of life, which they call samsara. So all of that is the broader context that he starts with, and then he, of course,
who is the author, by the way?
Sorry, well, the author is so the author is Shiv Ananda Sarasvati. He was a sannyasin in the Sarasvati lineage, which is part of the Darshanami order. It's a sort of generally Shaiva ascetic order, often based in monasteries. And he sort of traces his lineage back to Vyasa and Shankara, and the Shankara that he's referring to is Adi Shankara, the famous Advaita Vedanta philosopher who lived in the 8th century and interpreted the Upanishads, the sort of most widely known layer of the Vedas, in a sort of coherent philosophical way, and because the Upanishads are quite a diverse corpus, so he looked at the teachings of the Upanishads and tried to bring them together in a coherent dialogue. And he sort of set the scene of what's called Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta, for the centuries that followed him. And then he had various students and other teachers within that lineage who varied his interpretation or reinterpreted his interpretation in different ways. But by the 16th, 17th century, Shivananda saw himself very much as part of that lineage, and he was special in terms of the history of yoga because he took the rather strong position that yoga was necessary for achieving the ultimate realization that's taught in the Upanishads. And that's something that within that sort of philosophical lineage had always been ambiguous, that, Shankara himself...
Yeah. When you say
rejected,
yoga, you mean yoga asana or hatha yoga? Hatha yoga.
Yeah, the practice of yoga. Quite broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking, right.
But Shankara himself had rejected Patanjali yoga. It sort of basically said it doesn't lead to liberation because it's because it's philosophical, the type of philosophy that it was associated with. But he sort of left the door open for yoga, particularly with his commentaries on some of the Upanishads that mention yoga, such as the Katha Upanishad as well as the Bhagavad Gita, which he wrote a commentary on. He sort of leaves the door open by saying that, yes, yoga is important for purifying the mind, and when the mind is pure, then you can understand the truths within the Upanishads more easily. But other philosophers that followed him, as well as Shankara himself, basically emphasized that it was, reading or listening to the teachings of the Upanishads, contemplating them, having the guru teach them to you, that they were really the essential methods for reaching that realization. And so many of them would then turn around and say, well, yoga's superfluous. It's not really necessary. It might help with purifying the mind, but at the end of the day, if you understand the truths of the Upanishads, that happens anyway. So it played an ambiguous role. Some philosophers rejected it on that basis, whereas others actually saw it as a useful thing to include within their texts. And by the 16th and 17th century, we see more and more of philosophers from the lineage of Advaita Vedanta accepting yoga, and not only accepting it, but writing texts on it where it's the main topic, and really going into it in a deep way, really looking at all the different traditions, the different techniques, looking at general topics about how the yogin should live, what a yogin should and shouldn't do, their diet, all those sorts of things, all those sorts of topics are in these larger compendiums, which I think makes them very valuable literature, particularly for anyone interested in the history of yoga, because they're a compendium. They take a lot of the earlier material and bring it all together. So rather than having to, read some Puranas, read the Bhagavad Gita, read Patanjali's Yoga Shastra, and try and understand each of those texts in their, on their own terms, you can look at a text like the Yoga Chintamani and see all of that material coming together in, around the topic of yoga specifically. And that's what was a lot of gurus, of course, were doing in the early 20th century. Krishnamacharya, Shiv Ananda Sarasvati,
very
and so forth.
similar in a way. That's
right. They were teaching yoga.
They
were teaching the practice of yoga, and then in the background there was, a dialogue around Vedanta and some of the philosophical implications of what they were teaching, particularly when they were asked some of the bigger questions like, what is yoga? Why practice it? And what's liberation and moksha and so forth. You'll see in the books, the early publications of the 20th century, that these issues are addressed. And that's really what Shivananda was doing in the Yoga Chintamani. It's a sort of late 16th, early 17th century text that anticipates the way teachings on yoga were formulated in the early 20th century and then ultimately disseminated outside India.
Yeah. How different is it to the Amaralga that comes before it in terms of the asana practice? Like, I'm looking at trying to trace, because in this case, in the Chintamani, it's particular of interest to students of asana because it's the first time when you've got loads of them. You've got 84, I think, described. Is that right? And then extra ones adding up to 112. Is that right?
So there's 84 names listed, and it's possibly one of the earliest texts that lists 84, and it happens to list them in alphabetical order in a table, which is quite nice as well, quite unusual. And it describes 54 asanas, and of those, about 35 are taken from earlier works, so they're they're known from texts such as the Hatha Pradipika and various Puranas. So no real surprises there. But then about 20 or 19 or 20 are untraced. That's perhaps the first time we see them in, written down, recorded. And yes, then this I must say is a longer version of the Yoga Chintamani that I focus on. It's a slightly different story. So I was for my doctoral work, which looked at texts such as the Amanaska and the Amarauga. They're really telling us about how Hatha and Raja Yoga were first formulated in texts, at least around the 11th, 12th century. And it seems that at that time they started off perhaps as independent yogas. Raja Yoga required a preliminary yoga, but in the Amanaska there's no mention of Hatha. And a lot of, it sort of pictures itself as transcending all other types of yoga. So it's quite critical of a lot of yoga practices. Pranayama, for instance, is just hard work, causes suffering, and takes a more Gnostic approach that if you practice Shambhavi Mudra and achieve Samadhi, then that's all you need to do. The Amarauga is quite special because it teaches some of the physical mudras that become associated with the subsequent tradition of Hatha Yoga. Mahamudra, Mahaveda, Mahabandha, those three, and they're practiced as a sequence. And it also teaches Raja Yoga, but in a very minimal way, and just sort of says Hatha Yoga leads to Raja Yoga. So you get this sort of relationship between the physical practices and the meditative state. That's what I think is quite important about the Amarauga. And as I say, we're just getting the sort of bare bones of these yogas. They're rudimentary at this stage. They're just starting out. They haven't really developed very much. And so that I think makes the texts very interesting, but also difficult to work on because, they're very terse and pithy and don't offer much explanation. There's lots of questions we'd like to ask the author, but he or she just provides the bare minimum. So hard to work on from that point of view. A lot of gaps that are, difficult to fill in. But then the text, going up to the 15th, 16th, 17th century, the texts start to get longer. As I say, in the 15th century, the Hatha Pradipika brings together different traditions and puts them into a sort of a format that's widely accepted of asana, pranayama, mudra, and Raja Yoga as the fourth component. And as you and many of your of the audience would know, with asana in the Hatha Pradipika, we start to get non-seated postures. So in most of the early texts, the only asanas that are taught are seated poses, in particular Padmasana and Siddhasana. And that's because the emphasis of the practice is mainly on pranayama and mudra, where you're in a seated position. But with the Hatha Pradipika, we start to get asanas that are balancing on the hands, such as Mayurasana, the peacock pose, and twists such as Matsyendrasana, strong twists, and Kukutasana, another hand balancing pose. And these are clearly not for meditation, but in my view, they were probably brought into the tradition because of their healing benefits. In fact, we get separate verses on the healing benefits of Mayurasana and Matsyendrasana.
So more kind of Ayurvedic in a way, rather than kind of energetic, like less kind of tantric, more kind of making sure that you're okay physically so you can sit in meditation.
Yes, that, but also some yogic goals. So Matsyendrasana is supposed to awaken Kundalini and make her straight, according to the earliest version of the text that we've got. So there are some yogic aims and you might say energetic effects, but I must say the emphasis is more on healing diseases, generally speaking. And I can say that having sort of recently read some Tibetan manuals that discuss postural practice, and there you see a strong emphasis on energetic effects, the movement of prana and apana through the body, and how it can be manipulated through the practice of a particular posture or postural movement. That's not so much the case in the Indian literature that we have, even though I think, it was nonetheless probably there in the background. the emphasis is more on healing diseases for asana, as some of the texts explicitly state. You can heal illness through asana, mental disturbances through pranayama, destroy bad accumulated karma through pratyahara, and then end up achieving liberation through samadhi. They sort of go up through the angas, through the auxiliary practices that way. So I think asana in the Indian tradition was associated with healing. And as the Hatha Pradipika says, it's when it sort of says in general terms why asana is taught as the first anga, it says it's for healing diseases or freedom from diseases, as well as achieving the optimal state of physical fitness, anga partava. Although in later recensions of that text, it's called anga lagava, which is more about lightness of limbs and dexterity, perhaps, or moving around easily enough. So I think that's more the emphasis, why these non-seated poses came into the tradition. And when they were accepted by the time of the Hatha Pradipika, after that, more and more flood in to the tradition, and that's what we see in the Yoga Chintamani. So in the original version of the Yoga Chintamani, which was written by Shiv Ananda Sarasvati, he outlines 35 asanas, and they're mainly from earlier texts, so there's no real surprises there. It's just a sort of large compilation, perhaps the largest of its time, of earlier material. But then as I was sort of doing archival research in India and looking for manuscripts of the Yoga Chintamani, I came across a manuscript in a library that had a lot of annotations added to it. So you had the original text written out, and in the margins and even between the lines of the text, the scribe had written additional information. And the scribe was particularly active, if you like, or particularly elaborate in annotating the asana chapter. And that's where we see the extra 20 asanas, descriptions of asanas described, that we don't find in earlier texts, where we see the 84 names listed in a table, and then we sort of get a third list of about 112 or so names sort of scribbled at the end of that section. And when I found this manuscript, and it's dated, it was dated, I think, 1657 or so maybe 50 years after Shivananda wrote the original work. To me, it was a light bulb moment for solid evidence for the inclusion of large numbers of postures within the practice of yoga, within the sort of context and teaching of yoga. And 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, when I was working on this, that was an important discovery, because at the time, the dilemma was that in the 20th century, there were gurus teaching dozens and dozens of asanas, as you know, through the Ashtanga teachings, as well as Iyengar and Desikachar, Shivananda, and so forth. If you looked at the aggregate number, it would probably be hundreds of different asanas. And yet the texts available at the time, and the texts that these gurus were referring to, such as the Yoga Sutras, the Hatha Pradipika, and Shiva Samhita, those disseminated widely in the late 19th, early 20th century, really teach just a handful of postures. So everybody practicing yoga sort of knew that asana, postural practice, was an important part of yoga. But at the same time, we were all thinking, well, where do these asanas come from? What's the evidence for the practice of these postures before the 20th century? And that is something that is slowly coming to light through archival research, through finding texts that haven't been edited and translated, and not the sort of prominent ones, such as the Yoga Sutras and the Hatha Pradipika that gurus have referred to in the 20th century.
I know it seems like a simplistic question, but I mean, just for our listeners, could you draw a line from the earliest dissemination of Mahaveda, Mahabandha, Mahamudra, like an incremental increase in the asanas? Then would it go then the Hatha Pradipika, and then from there the Amaralga, and then you see what I'm saying? And then how does the Hatha Vyasa Padati fit into with the Chintamani?
Yes, okay, that's a good question. So with the Amaralga and its mudras, it doesn't acknowledge asana as an auxiliary practice as we see in the Ashtanga system or the Hatha Pradipika's fourfold Anga system. It's really just the practice of mudras, and incorporated within the mudras is a strong postural element. Maha mudra is sort of done in a Janu Shirshasana type position.
Yeah.
And then there's pranayama. You breathe in and hold the breath, and you apply the bandhas. So these elements, the asana pranayama element, are sort of rolled into one, and it's called mudra, physical mudra. Then those three mudras are increased to a collection of 10 from roughly the 12th century through to the 15th century. And the mudras that are added are things like inverting the body, viparita karani, which is, turning the body upside down, probably headstand, but could also be shoulder stand. Khechari mudra, putting the tongue up into the nasopharyngeal cavity, and Vadroli, drawing the seminal fluids back up through the urethra into the body. So that's really the focus of early Hatha Yoga. And then we start to see Kumbhaka, the practice of holding the breath, as generally under the category of pranayama, breath control. We start to see that creeping in to some of the early texts. So the 4 of those are taught in a text called the Goraksha Shataka, which dates to around the 14th century. Then, as I've said, it's the Hatha Pradipika in the 15th century that takes asana. Some of the earlier texts do teach Padmasana and Siddhasana as part of Hatha Yoga. But then the Hatha Pradipika takes the, I suppose, the designation of asana and then includes many more postures. Some of them, 7 of them being non-seated, 8 being seated. It then has a separate chapter on pranayama, which has 8 kumbhakas, 8 different ways of holding the breath. And then it has the chapter on mudra, which is well formed or well developed by that time. It's the 10 mudras, plenty of material from earlier texts to draw on there. And then it's got a chapter on really the goal of those physical practices, which is Raja Yoga. With the Yoga Chintamani, it's based on the Ashtanga format. So, that's not a surprise given the Vedantic type of environment. Generally, if a more philosophical Vedantic text is going to incorporate yoga, Ashtanga and Patanjali tends to be the format, the basis. And so Shiv Ananda takes Hatha Yoga with its more developed, if you like, practice of asana by that stage and pranayama with the bandhas, and fills out the angas of asana and pranayama within the Ashtanga system. So that's where you see the Hatha Pradipika and Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, a lot of the earlier texts, Yoga Bija being quoted when it comes to the discussions on asana and pranayama. And then, yes, and then of course...
sorry, Jason, just for our listeners again, to be clear, it's very... What he's doing, you're saying he's filling out Patanjali's asanas, but the Vyasa, the Vyasa, the commentary of Patanjali only mentions a few, right? So he is somewhat innovating on Patanjali. It's not like Patanjali also inferred all these asanas, right? He's developed.
Yes. Yeah. So the Bhashya, the Bhashya mentions about 12 postures, but of course they're defined in a commentary by Shankara, and they're seated postures.
Yeah.
Pretty much. So what we're starting to see with the Shivananda's work is, a variety of postures beyond the seated ones, including Shavasana and arm balancing and back bending and twisting and all that sort of thing. So it's definitely the idea of more dynamic. There's a couple of moving postures as well. The idea of non-seated asanas, non-symmetrical, designed to build strength and flexibility and dynamic in some respects. That seems to have been established in yoga by that time. And so he incorporates it into his text under the anga of asana. And then the kumbhakas and so forth, as well as the mudras that are applied during the different phases of breath in pranayama, are brought in under the anga, under the auxiliary of pranayama. So that's how, in a general discussion of yoga that's based on the Ashtanga format, the 8 auxiliary format, that's where the physical traditions of Hatha Yoga tended to be integrated. That's at those points of asana and pranayama. Then with the extended version that I was referring to, written 50 or so years, or annotated 50 or so years after Shivananda wrote the text, more asanas were added. And then with the Hatha Paddhati, what we're starting to see, I think, in the 18th century, maybe a couple of centuries later, is a very sophisticated practice where there's the practice is much more dynamic. There's a lot more movement, particularly repetitive movement. There's sequencing going on. Clearly, one asana is related to the next, and sort of helps one to move into it. The asanas are broken up into 6 groups, and yes, you can sort of see that the postural practice would require years and years of practice to achieve it. It's very dynamic and requires extreme strength and flexibility. So it's not for the average person. It's for a dedicated practitioner, and being done at a regular practice at the highest level, if you like. So that, I think, sort of suggests a fairly sophisticated culture of physical practice in yoga by the 18th century, with influences perhaps from Indian wrestling, particularly a couple of the way a couple of the movements link together. We've seen in some wrestling manuals the tendency to do that in their postural practice, as well as possibly martial training. And there's also, as the text explicitly states, there's a strong emphasis on building physical strength. It says that the asanas should be practiced to build physical strength so that you can then go on to practice the Shatkarma, which, funnily enough, is a slightly different relationship between asana and the Shatkarma, these sort of therapeutic interventions that we see in the Hatha Pradipika, where the Shatkarma are there really just for practitioners who have too much phlegm or fat to practice pranayama, and then the sort of 6 therapeutic actions or interventions, if you like, are practiced to reduce fat and phlegm so that the practitioner can then do pranayama. And if they don't have an issue with phlegm or fat, then they don't need to do them. Well, in the Hatha Paddhati, the Shatkarma are a compulsory practice for everybody. You practice asana in order to build up strength to do the Shatkarma in quite an intense way.
The asanas are the same in the Paddhati and the Chintamani, or they're very different? And leading
no,
on
they're quite
that,
different. No,
right.
so
and obviously we're not talking about either the asanas having read the Chintamani and the Paddhati. We're not even talking about the asanas we know today either, nor with most of them not the same names and not the same postures either, right? Is that correct?
Yes,
that's right. We can't say, okay, we've got this practice now that we know from a Iyengar, Ashtanga, blah, blah, blah. And, the same, I mean, as much as we might like to, we can certainly say asana is an old practice, is pretty old, but not the asanas that we know. Is that correct?
Well, what I would say is that there's really a core group of asanas that is very prevalent, if you like, and very ancient. So Padmasana and Siddhasana. Padmasana going back, maybe 2,000 years in figures in most expositions of yoga, Padmasana. And then from, the idea of putting the heel against the perineum as you do pranayama or meditation creeps into some tantric context, but then becomes a sort of more common element of yoga from about 1,000 years ago. And so I think we see a core group of seated poses. There's maybe half a dozen of them. They're mentioned in the Bhashya, but also in a lot of tantric texts, maybe, 4 to 6. And then the poses that we get in the Hatha Pradipika are the non-seated asanas, Mayurasana, Matsyendrasana, those Dhanurasana, those sort of, they become a sort of core group in later texts that incorporate non-seated postures. And I think that's the case today. If you look at Iyengar Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga, there's usually Matsyendrasana, there's usually Mayurasana, Dhanurasana in one of its at least 2 variations, and so forth. Kukutasana, Uttana Kukutasana. These poses tend to occur in most of the texts after the 16th century, and I think it's the case in modern yoga. But then after that, around that, what we start to see are, a lot of different postures that are taught with that core group. And that's where I think if you took the postures of all the texts and, looked at and tried to formulate a list of the different postures, it would run into the hundreds of postures from, at least up until the end of the 18th century. It's, of course, not always possible to distinguish one posture from another because the descriptions are often not detailed enough, or that we often just have the name of an asana without necessarily a good description of it. But yes, I think it's fairly conservative to say that if you tried to formulate a list of an aggregate number of postures, it would run into the hundreds, 300.
And these asanas, the Chintamani, are, just to set the scene, a lot of them are pretty advanced. I'm surprised, well, to say the least. Right, we were talking before we started about one that's formulated upon balancing upon an elbow, almost, right? So they're are they even possible, we wonder? No?
Well, that's why, I'd like to see you give them a go, Adam, to see a dedicated practitioner like yourself. Could pick up the book, you could have your yoga mat laid out and then pick up the book and sort of read the posture and then try it. And then, after 20 years of practice, then you could tell us whether it's possible or not. With the pose you're talking about, Shunyasana, that's, I've seen it. There's actually some film footage of a sadhu in a documentary on the Kumbh Mela performing Shunyasana as it's described in the text. So it's described, the first stage of the pose is described as having both fists on the ground. And then you lean forward and you place your toes on their respective elbows. So it looks a little bit like Kukutasana, crow pose. It looks a little bit like Asana, the modern day Bakasana. Where you place the hands on the ground, but usually people put their shins on the upper arms.
Yeah, the knees on the shins. Yeah. And now it's the toes. Well, that's upping the ante.
Yeah, and you got your fists on the ground instead of your hands. I also find that more difficult for the balance with the fists on the. It's a bit like, if you do push-ups on your fists, you could probably develop the strength within your hands to sort of hold your body weight that way. But the balance is then tricky. That's the first stage of the pose. The second stage is, once you've done that, is that you seem to have to lean your body weight onto the left hand, onto the left fist, and then take the right hand and the right foot up into the air. So you're just on one hand with one foot braced against the elbow. I've never seen that done.
So funnily enough.
But I'm sure. Look, when my wife Jacqueline Hargreaves was making a film reconstruction for the Hatha Yoga a few years ago, there were poses in that text that we thought impossible, to reconstruct, that it just couldn't be done. And then we went to India and we spent time with a school of young kids in India that were practicing for the national championships. They were practicing 4 or 5 hours a day for the national championships. And they did every asana except for one, which is a bit of a weird posture because it requires ropes and weights, and that was it. Yeah, I think need a guru for that pose. But the other 111 postures they were able to do, and it required extreme strength and flexibility. And at the beginning, the beginning of the week, they couldn't do them. They were sort of shaking and falling all over the place. At the end of the week, they generally, out of say 12 students, there was somebody within that group who could do
every posture. Yeah.
Well, one. So there was nobody who could do all of the postures, but there seemed to be someone who could do one of the postures. And so in the film footage, we have all different people doing different postures because that's just how it worked out. I think through years and years of practice, you would eventually get someone who could do all of the postures.
Can we see that footage anywhere?
It should be released. So it was part of an exhibition at the end of the Hatha Yoga project. And now that the book is being published and we've sort of advanced the research, we're hoping at some point to release the film footage, because that will go nicely with.
Will. I think people will love to see that. So what am I going to say next? I mean, one thing that struck me at the end of the Chintamani actually was the fact that you mentioned that the techniques, the practice itself are shared, and even within, you mentioned also other texts, Islamic texts, in which are the Persian text, in which the Chintamani seems to have a certain kind of Persian rendition. So there's a kind of cross-fertilization of these practices. But then you mentioned, interestingly, that there are different aims and intentions behind them. And that strikes me for the Chintamani, right? Because when you were talking previously about prior textual precedents, Mahaveda, Mahabandha, etc., and this is Tantra, right? This is the use of the body to energize the spine and awaken the Kundalini. But in this rendition with Chintamani, I think you were quite clear, I believe, if I read correctly, that he's not really looking towards that. It's more like yoga for health and a kind of Vedantic rendition of using the asana to kind of, what is it, to still the mind, or is he still looking? I mean, I wouldn't say it's a tantric text if I've understood correctly.
Yes, so definitely the philosophical portions of the text are Vedantic and not tantric. So he is aiming at gnosis of the highest reality, and the highest reality is that the individual self and the supreme self are one and the same thing. The Atman and the Paramatman are one and the same. And he's trying to achieve that gnosis, that knowledge, sort of sacred knowledge, if you like, or realized knowledge, through the practice of samadhi. That's really the key practice that enables the yogi to grasp that truth in a sort of a transformative way, completely transforms the way the yogi looks at the world and experiences the world and so forth. It's not just knowledge that you get from reading a book or, watching the news. That it's a sort of a life-changing knowledge, if you like.
But and in a sense, it's not the Hatha Yoga that we know then. There are forcing, something mechanical in the body to change the mind. Rather, it's still the yoga of the mind, auxiliary practice being asana to help with that Gnostic.
Yes, well, but yes, although it is similar in the sense that the physical practices are being employed to achieve that meditative state. So that is similar in both cases. It's just that with Hatha Yoga, I think the framework is much more basic. It's you practice the physical techniques, they lead to the meditative states. The meditative states enable you to realize that truth of the self In the Yoga Chintamani, you're getting the Ashtanga format. So there's yama niyama, the behavioral codes and the preliminary practices. Then there's asana. Then there's pranayama. Then there's pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, the meditative techniques. And then at the end of that, there's samadhi. And it's two types of samadhi as we see in Patanjali. Samadhi with an object, samadhi without an object, samprajnata, asamprajnata samadhi. And that it's only when you achieve the highest state of samadhi that you have the chance or the opportunity to realize that ultimate truth. And the ultimate truth is described in that Vedantic discourse of the individual self and the supreme self and everything that goes with that. Why ignorance being the reason that the average person can't see it or doesn't understand it and thinks that there's a sort of world of multiplicity of manifold things around them, and this sort of accumulated karma that the person carries around from their earlier life, contributing to that, and it's not until they burn up that karma through the practice of yoga or through liberating knowledge that they can then realize this ultimate truth. So all of that is presented in a Vedantic context rather than a tantric one or a Patanjali yoga one. If you pick up the Yoga Sutra, a book on the Yoga Sutras with the Bhashya, with the commentary, it's more of a Sankhyan orientation, which is a different school of philosophy based on Purusha and Prakriti, the sort of spiritual witness or the inner witness and the material world. So none of that is really in the Yoga Chintamani. It's more of a Vedantic setting.
With Patanjali,
but actually, just to pick up on the Persian connection, because you mentioned the Persian connection, and I should talk about that because it takes up 10 pages of the introduction, and it was a sort of an unexpected discovery, a big surprise, really, that I started to see the same material in Persian texts. So some of the additional asanas that are in this long version, this annotated version of the Yoga Chintamani, are described by the same name and almost word for word in a Persian text that was composed at the beginning of the 17th century so it was composed around the mid 16th century, but we have an illustrated version of it from the beginning of the 17th century called the Bahr al-Hayat. It was composed in North India.
Glad you said that word.
At that time.
Yeah.
And that teaches a collection of 22 asanas, I think, 22 or 24. And it's an extraordinary collection. And it's been studied by scholars of Persian, such as Karl Ernst and Fabrizio Speciali, and Persianists that are looking at the history of yoga. And this illustrated version of the text, which is in a library in Dublin, was part of the exhibition at the Smithsonian Institute 5 or 6 years ago, Yoga, the Art of Transformation. And it's in that catalogue. You can see some of the pictures from that folio. So it's probably the earliest illustrated text on yoga that we have. And the 22, 24 asanas are extraordinary because they're very sophisticated. They're this asana I was talking about, shunyasana, where you're balancing at the beginning on two fists and then eventually on one fist with the elbows with the feet on the elbows. That's one of these postures. Other postures incorporate breathing techniques, and then there's also visualization practices as well. So everything's going on in this postural practice. And the extraordinary thing about this, of course, is that the text was written for Sufis. So, and when we start to look at the textual parallels, not only with the Yoga Chintamani, but other texts that I also found these asanas in, one being a Hindi work on astronomy, Svara Shastra, it's called, that sort of prognostication of the future through nasal dominance, by sort of knowing which side of the nose your breath is dominant in during an important event or at an important astrological moment and then being able to tell the future from that. Usually how long you've got to live. And if the yogi knows that they only have 6 months to live, then they can practice yoga techniques to dodge death in 6 months' time and prolong their life that way. So that's sort of the yogic aspect of Svara Shastra. But Svara Shastra had a sort of very worldly application, and that is that, probably more directed towards kings and aristocrats. If they knew that when the auspicious moment that the breath should flow through a certain side of the nose at, say, the time of conception, they could then predict that they would have a male heir, male child. Or likewise, if they would win or lose a war. A lot of secular uses, if you like, of this astronomical type of knowledge. So the extraordinary thing is that these sophisticated postures, this sort of sophisticated postural practice is taught within the framework of this system of astronomy, which is something I haven't completely understood, like exactly how it fits into that. I mean, because it's very easy to change nasal dominance. You can, just press one hand under one armpit for long enough, hard enough, and then usually your breath will switch to the other nostril. You can lie on one side of the body and it will switch to the other side. You can put a sort of a wooden rod, a dunda type of thing under one arm, stick, and change your nasal dominance. You could put your foot under there, Dandasana, type of, or what do they call it in modern yoga? Where you take your foot back and you place it. That will change your nasal dominance if you hold it for long enough. If you haven't experienced that, try it. And yes, but of course, Shunyasana and the other 22 or so postures are doing much more than that. They're doing much more than just changing nasal dominance. And so it seems that these yogis were interested in astronomy, in being able to predict the time of death, predict whether a king would win or lose a war, predict whether an aristocrat would have a son or a daughter when his wife got pregnant. And yet they were also practicing yoga to a very high level. So this is interesting because this sort of combination of yoga and astronomy was also the sort of talking point, if you like, or the main focal point of exchange between yogis and Sufis. Sufis were really interested in this astronomical type of practice, and they also were interested in the yoga practices, as we see from the Bahrul Hayat and these asanas that are taught. The reason that this research was so exciting is that, of course, scholars have believed and, I suppose, conjectured that there would have been interaction between yogis and Sufis. But what we have now is, of course, textual evidence for that, and we can put these texts side by side and see exactly how that interaction took place. And what I think we're seeing is that the physical practices were fairly faithfully transferred from one tradition to another. But what changes is the way those practices, the benefits, the way those benefits are interpreted and recorded. And that's what we see in the Bahrul Hayat, that instead of, generally the physical benefits are mentioned in the Persian text, but instead of, the more Gnostic or religious goals of practice, such as becoming one with Shiva, if it's a Shaiva tradition or something like that, we see that changed into a more Sufi-orientated benefit. And that, I think, is very, very interesting, because there are parallels with that in the more modern history of yoga, where we see yoga being transferred from one environment to another. The physical practices often, seem to travel with a fair amount of integrity, but the dialogue around them changes. It could move into sort of a very therapeutic or medical dialogue in one instance, or it could move more into a fitness orientated dialogue, or it could move into sort of, the spiritual new age type of dialogue. Everybody has their take on what these asanas can do. And, we sort of see that as yoga practices move from one tradition to another within the Indian traditions themselves, but then also now with Sufi practice.
I think it's important also to highlight the fact that they do move within the Indian tradition themselves. It's not just Westerners appropriating yoga to take the techniques and use them for something totally other. I mean, even the time of Krishnamacharya, we see him kind of almost synthesizing a whole bunch of different things onto asana at one point. It seemed to be energetic at another point. It seemed to be just about Chitta-Vritti and Rodha at other points. They're therapeutic for for health reasons. So it really is a precedent for this within Krishnamacharya, within the modern day, and it's going back a long way, I believe. I mean, to that end, the last thing I'd like to clarify with you is, I think there's often, and you mentioned it in your book, there's often this idea that I heard, and I have to say, I have to put hand on heart and admit that I repeated this as well, that Patanjali and the Yoga Sutras is a text that was never that popular in India, or at least it fell out of fashion for thousands of years and only was brought back by Vivekananda in the at the start of the 20th century, And from what you're saying, that was not the case at all, that it had a resounding popularity throughout, at least from the 12th century, at least, so it was actually a seminal text, as it were.
Yes, absolutely. I think throughout the 1700 years since the text has been composed, particularly in the first millennium, it's very important work and translated into Arabic or reinterpreted into Arabic, and the object of discussion in just about every philosophical school. And then what we see, I think, in the, from the 10th to the 15th century, it's very much there. In the background, commentaries are still being written on it. And then usually with Vedanta, their main point of reference, as well as learned commentaries, if you happen to be reading a commentary on a piece of kavya, a piece of poetry, and there's a reference to yoga, often the explanation that a commentary will give will have the sort of terminology of Patanjali's yoga. So it seems that, the pundit, even if the pundit wasn't a practitioner of yoga or had much of an interest, if they needed a reference, if they needed to look something up, they reached back and there was possibly a copy of the Patanjali Yoga Shastra on their shelf, and they'd, fish that out and write down an explanation for the text. But then from the 15th century to the 20th century, Patanjali Yoga features in many compendiums. And was definitely when it came to the composition of these scholarly works, was definitely one of the most important traditions of yoga that considered at that time. So the fact that we see Vivekananda, Krishnamacharya, and other gurus of the 20th century taking again, I suppose, doing the same thing, formulating yoga within the parameters of Patanjali Yoga, particularly the Ashtanga system, and then bringing in practices from elsewhere within that format. I think that very consistent with, the approach that we see, for example, in the Yoga Chintamani.
Yeah. And finally, we don't see mention of the Chintamani in Krishnamacharya's lists and his books of his bibliography or references, right? I think we see the Hatha Padati, right? I mean, any final words to say, anything further on Krishnamacharya's asana influences, having spent a lot of time studying this, because I know that this question is very dear to people's hearts, so it's not exactly on the Chintamani. As I say, it seems to have bypassed Krishnamacharya. You mentioned that Kavalidam Ashram has a kind of copy, I believe. So that was a precedent of from Swami Kaivalyananda, who was knowledgeable on that. But Krishnamacharya, not so much.
I don't think there's any evidence for him using the Yoga Chintamani or referencing it, referring to it. And I think that for him, Patanjali Yoga, as well as some of the key texts that he had at his disposal, the Hatha Pradipika and the Hatha Vyasa being the two main ones, as well as the Sri Tattvanidhi being a sort of an illustrated version of the Hatha Vyasa as well as what he learned from his guru, and the influences, the things that were going on around him, particularly within the palace, the Mysore palace, that I think was probably made up the main sort of the bulk of the material that he synthesized into his system of yoga, as well as knowledge of Ayurveda. He was very learned in other systems of philosophy. I imagine that he, could draw on various Puranas, the Gita, the texts that he would have studied as a boy, just in his Brahmanical education, and whatever teachings he would have seen on yoga in those texts, he would have also been able to draw upon. But in terms of going outside of that, the standard fare, then yes, the Hatha Pradipika, the Hatha Vyasa and the chapter within the Sri Tattvanidhi, as well as what his guru taught him, and perhaps his own practice as well. I sort of get the feeling he was very innovative. In fact, you sort of see that as if you look across his publications, how one thing sort of develops into the other, and that would have also, I suppose, emerged with his teaching. As he's teaching young boys in the Mysore palace, he would have been trying to meet their needs with a fairly demanding physical practice, to keep them occupied. And then later in life, when he's in Chennai, it seems that he was focused more on healing people's illnesses and the therapeutic effects of yoga later in life. So that, the fact he lived for so long would also account, I think, for some of the changes that we see in his teachings. Yes, so
slightly off piece, but thank you, Jason, for rounding that up a little bit, because I know people are always very interested in hearing Krishnamacharya's influences, because they directly affect what people are doing today. Well, there's a lot more to be said about the Chintamani. Get a copy of it when you can. I think you're going to release it also. Do I understand that public online publication at a certain point as well? Does the book go online so people can access it for free?
Yeah, it does after a year. A digital copy will be made available. So it is it will be an open access publication. But it's also been, subsidized. The printed book has been subsidized, which is why it's only 20 euros. So, but it is available only through the École Française in Pondicherry. So I can send a link, and perhaps
we'll put it in.
It's just a matter of sending the details to the librarian. And she organises the book.
Yeah. You're not shipping them out yourself from your home in Tasmania.
No, I didn't. They didn't trust me.
You undertake
by giving
that
me any
job.
Books.
Well, yeah.
No, they realised that I'd probably just give them away. And
your speciality was elsewhere. I mean, the level of detail in the text is incredible.
Not selling them. That was
writing them was hard enough. For any, I think it's very unfair that often, people will say about a Western academia, it's got a bias or there's some underlying agenda here. I hear this a lot, and often it seems like they then accuse you of somehow trying to make the asana tradition westernized or something like that. Have you heard that kind of thing? And I mean, it just struck me to finish off with us and our conversation today that I can't really understand that, because what you're doing is the very opposite. I mean, you're just showing how much of a precedent and how much of a tradition this asana tradition does have, I wonder if you meet that criticism yourself.
Yes, I get it.
You can defend yourself now. I'll give you the opportunity.
Yes, and I'd love to say that that I'm completely innocent. But yeah. But there's politics in yoga. So if your version of the history suits somebody else who's teaching yoga or trying to, increase their influence within the yoga world, well, then they love you. But if you present a version of the history that contradicts somebody who's teaching yoga or has a vested interest in yoga, and you're maybe they're saying that the teaching, their particular teaching, is 5,000 years old, and it's the most prominent tradition within India, and it's all the great gurus have known it, whether secretly or otherwise, and then I present a history that doesn't mention their tradition or mentions that it didn't play much of a role in the text that I'm looking at, or the type of yoga I'm looking at. Well, then I suppose I'm the enemy, because there's even if I'm not speaking directly to them, there's a sort of implicit contradiction there that they often feel the need to address. And then there's the politics within India, where it's very political now. Modi's practicing yoga and saying that it's part of Hindu identity, and so if you talk about Buddhism or Sufis and so forth, or their contribution of Jainism and Buddhism to yoga, that doesn't always go down very well. And as you know, between lineages, if if you're a student of Patabi Joyce as opposed to a student of Iyengar, and you're doing very different practices, and a conversation breaks out about the right way to do an asana, or which practice yields the greater benefits and whatever, well, then it's very easy to end up on the wrong side of that and turn into a target. So any historian of yoga, I think, will come up against the politics from time to time. As well as teachers of yoga like yourself.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I do, and you're very level with it, Jason. Very diplomatic and very level. I really applaud that as well. And because there's great work to be done, and you guys, you, Jim, Daniela, Mark are doing that. And of course, you're not Indian, none of you, but you know your stuff, and it's great stuff that we're developing through people like yourselves. So thank you for coming on. Thanks for your time. And, I hope I hope we see you sooner again than in 3 years ago. That when you come on, when you do the Hatha Padati, when that's released, I hope to see you again then.
It won't be long, Adam. So maybe we'll be speaking again sooner rather than later. And it's always a pleasure to chat to you. And thanks very much for the invitation. It's sort of, the keen interest to not that was an intended pun. Your deep interest in yoga makes my research much more rewarding. To have someone like yourself read it and want to ask me questions about it, I couldn't really wish for a better outcome. So without people like yourself who can appreciate the work I'm doing, I probably would have quit years ago.
Good, because I loved it, really loved it, and it's really interesting. So it's a good marriage there. Thank you again. Cheers. Namo